afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Rivera Wilson with the Academy for Advancement of Teaching Leadership in Schools. Today is edTrends, Unpacking the New York State Science Learning Standards Across Grade Levels with the New York State Master Teacher. And to do the welcome of the presenters, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Rory Glass.
Thank you, Jerry. And as you can see, we have quite a list of people that are joining us today. Some of them, Regina just started this year with us, but has been a master teacher program for a while. She's not yet here, but she sent me an email that said she's trying to join us, but she's having a little bit of a fight with her Zoom. Jeanine and Lisa and Annette and I have been working together on this now for the last couple of years. And I'm really happy that today Alicia and Louisa have agreed to join us because they just started with the Master Teacher Program this February. They were part of our COVID cohort that had to wait nearly 2 years to hop on board with us. So it's really great to welcome them to this forum today. You can go to the next slide, Jerry. Before we begin, I did want to talk about, just briefly, the fact that this is the last session that we'll be doing for this year. When COVID happened back in the beginning of 2020, and Jerry and Atlas were wise enough to begin what was then called Community Conversations. I was participating quite often in those meetings and agreed to have master teachers do a presentation each month. And we started those, I believe, in June of 2020. So this has really come to be our second full year of doing these sessions. We've done them every month during the school season, usually launching sometime in the end of September, talking about what it's like to be back to schools. This year, we were really fortunate to get a little bit more collaboration across the state, and we were able to welcome master teachers from other regions. Since December, we've actually had master teachers join us from 6 of the 9 original master teacher regions, which I think is really great. And it's been able to give us much more of a statewide perspective and to explore areas that we really weren't able to do from just within our own cohort. So this is kind of a celebratory day. I thank all of you who have attended these regularly and even just drop by occasionally to join us for these. And as I mentioned before, many of the people who have joined me today to help facilitate this meeting are old hats at this and have done multiple sessions. And I welcome them back, and I welcome all of you to today's session. So thank you all for being here. Jerry, you can go to the next slide, and it'll be a quick one. As Jerry mentioned in the introduction, we're talking about unpacking the New York State Science Learning Standards across grade levels. This particular group has been meeting in one form or another since back in 2019 and the early part of 2019, before COVID was anywhere. We started actually in the spring of 2019, and just looking at the New York State Science Learning Standards and how they were aligned or not with the next generation science standards, which some people had already started to explore a little bit in their classrooms. Since then, we've taken many turns. And it was actually at the end of last year in 2021 that we started to look at how these standards really stacked up across grade levels and what that looked like and what it meant. And that was kind of a very natural evolution of conversations we were having from within the group at that time. Particularly between Lisa and Jeanine, who were both pretty active in this work during that period of time. So we have met every month and looked at different aspects of the science learning standards, looked at different threads going across grade levels, and you'll get a little bit more insight into that as we talk about it as we move forward. But just know that this is a group that has evolved to look at this alignment and this idea of how do these standards change between the kindergartner's experience and the high school student's experience in various areas of science. So you're getting a fairly evolved look at what we've come to discover. And as always, when you look at something that's broad and as far-reaching as standards and covering a span of grade levels as we are from K through 12, you find things that are curious and find things that are interesting, and you have some discovery of your own along the way, and you find things that just didn't work out or things that they missed. So hopefully we'll be able to share some of those insights with you today as well. You can go to the next slide, Jar. Again, here are my presenters. I have them, listed: Jeanine and Lisa and Annette, who've been here since the very beginning. Regina, who has been with us as a program participant for a long time, but just joined our happy little band of merry hunters through NYSLS this year. And then Alicia and Louisa, who just got to join us this year, finally, after a long wait. So I thank them very much for being here and helping me work on this presentation. Well, we can go to the next one. Lisa, this is for you.
Yeah, this is me. So hi, welcome everyone. So many of you may or may not know that NYSLS, when it was sort of voted on and accepted by New York State in 2017, was really supposed to roll out pretty quickly then. And many of us would have this year been preparing for the new tests. But as we are all getting through, COVID set that back, and they reset the rollout as well. So this is the last year for, I believe, for the fourth grade test, they'll be, or the last year, and they're rolling out the new elementary tests next year will be the first year for that. And then following that will be the living environment and earth science. And then the year following that will be the chemistry and physics. So within the next 3 years, we're looking at having new tests and rolling out all of the new standards, and we'll be expected to be teaching those standards in our classrooms really starting right away in our lower levels. But that doesn't mean that necessarily at the upper levels we should be ignoring them, and we should really be practicing and getting ready for those, because that will be what our students, even if we're seeing them in the 9th and 10th grade levels, 11 and 12 over the next couple of years, they're going to be experiencing these new tests as well. So preparing them for that. So an exciting change, I guess, over the next couple of years for all of us in science.
And just to add a tiny little bit to what Lisa was just mentioning, the assumption was that all along school districts starting back in 2018 would have been getting their students ready for this new form of exam. And all of you in schools know that that really didn't happen for a whole number of reasons. Sometimes it was as simple as not knowing where to begin. Sometimes it was as complicated as, well, our school's doing really well with the test. Why won't we keep preparing our students for the test that they're still taking instead of preparing them for a test that's going to roll out sometime in the future? So if you look at that ongoing curriculum and professional development line that dates back to 2018, and because of COVID and remote teaching and all of those other things, a lot of it just didn't happen when it was expected to. So it's kind of a nuanced thing. So you can go to the next slide, Jar. I thought it was important to give everyone just a little bit of background. So we're kind of starting with a common understanding. And knowing that NYSLS, the new standards as they're rolling out, are actually based on the next generation science standards, which were conceptually organized as a framework back in 2012. So it really does give you some insight into the scope and scale of how long it does take these larger movements to grab hold and start to unveil themselves. So it really has been a decade at this point that they've been out there and that people have known about it and been talking about it and still trying to figure out ways to implement it. If you look at the next generation standards, and we'll do that a little bit as we move forward, the progressions are organized into grade level bands. So there's a K2 band or an early elementary band, a 3-5 band, which is the later elementary, the intermediate level, which is what we would think of as middle school, the 6 through 8, and then the high school bands, which are 9 through 12. And obviously in a state like New York, each of those bands are different because of the way our content areas are broken up. And Jerry, you can go to the next one. that is a much cleaner slide. Very nice. We had a very blurry slide before. So understanding next gen standards, it's important that we focus on what is at the heart of next gen, which is this idea of the three-dimensional teaching. There is, you see here, the what students know, how students think, and what students do. Most importantly, when we look at them in terms of the science standards, the content area are disciplinary core ideas, the specific ideas that are embedded within a disciplinary area, so earth science or biology, whatever it might be. The practices are the science and engineering practices. So to give you an example, practices are things that scientists do. Many of you may have gone to school and taken your science classes back at the time of like the little scientist model, where we were interested in developing students that could think and act like scientists. This is kind of built from that. And the what students do, these science and engineering practices include things like making observations, analyzing data, creating models. Truly the work that scientists do, but it's formalized in these newer standards. And then how students think are these bigger concepts, these cross-cutting concepts like form and function or cause and effect. So these are big ideals that are all built into the areas of science very specifically, and addressed here very specifically, where there are lists of these cross-cutting concepts that you can actually go through and see them in terms of every different content area. You can go to the next slide, Jared. The next one is actually one of my favorite graphics because it gives you a sense of what this is actually talking about. And when we think about this three-dimensional learning model that Next Gen has kind of put forth, how these are all combined into one thing, which is listed here as a student performance expectation. So in terms of student performance expectations, it's really what students are going to be able to grapple with, think about, and do as a result of the education that they've gotten in this next generation model. So I like this representation because, as you can see, like the strands of the rope woven together, it gives you an idea that none of them function independently. And if you have ever taken apart, a corded string, realize that they're much weaker separately. And that's the ideal behind next gen standards, is that by weaving the practices into the disciplinary core ideas and the larger concepts that they embolden, that you're making a stronger connection for students. So that's why I love this graphic anyway. And you can go to the next one, Jar. So as if that's not enough, as if going from what we traditionally looked at in teaching a science class as teaching them all of that vocabulary and all of those processes that are all part of the science classroom, converting that to these three things, these ideas and these concepts and these practices, is still not quite enough because it really doesn't tell the whole picture. If you were to look at this as a bigger graphic, I think that the idea of phenomenon and guiding questions would probably be the frame that the 3D teaching model is built around, that's built within it, and that confines this idea. Phenomenon, I love that use of that term for this because it's really about things that students experience. It's about the things that cause them to get sucked into the learning, right? It gives them context. It gives them some experience that they can go, hey, that's really cool how that happens, or why, I wonder why that happens. So here, authentic experiences, curious occurrences, and curious occurrences are things that are happening in the real world. It could be, why did this hurricane develop so huge when another hurricane just a couple weeks ago didn't? Or why is this organism able to do that and these other ones can't? So those types of things that are really meant to give context, but also create this sense of wonderment for students to be awed. So this sense in phenomenon is that we are awing our students into being interested in what we're teaching. Then this idea of the guiding questions or the essential questions. As part of this three-dimensional teaching model, one of the key elements is that students are going to be driving the work. Even if you notice back in the beginning when I was talking about the science and engineering practices, and encompassing that into the work that students are doing are things like creating models. And that notion was very scary for a lot of teachers when they first saw the framework for K-12 education and this idea that we have students creating models to explain what's happening in a system. But that is really what we're hoping to do, is that we can pose questions that are going to drive student learning through their own curiosity, through inquiry, through analysis of data that's available, those sorts of things. And here I put the term wondering, because that is the idea. We're going to pose a question and the students are going to have to really wonder, I wonder how that really works, or I wonder if that applies to this, or those sorts of things. So that's kind of a brief introduction to give you a sense of what NextGen is about and kind of how it is presented and how it looks and how it's framed. As we go to the next one, as you can imagine too, when we do any work like this, you go into a lot of rabbit holes. And this year, the Science Teacher Association of New York State, their theme for their annual conference was story. And so one of the rabbit holes we hopped into was storylines. So as I was starting to say before, we looked at different types of storyline. And one of the things that was shared with us that we looked at as a group were storylines that were kind of fake and seemed kind of constructed, artificial sense. And one of them that I remember vividly was about this girl who was a chemistry enthusiast, and the storyline was basically talking, dialogue between her and a friend of hers, talking about exploring different concepts with this new chemistry kit that she had gotten. And as we were reading through it, it was really nice how neatly it tied everything up in a bow about the chemistry students. But what it didn't do was it didn't provide anything that sounded like any student that any of us had ever seen in any classroom ever. So Jeanine was able to share with us the story that she had done when doing a unit on buoyancies. And you can see that this is something that seems very authentic. This one character, Jan, tosses the ball, and Maggie and Mo are the dogs that go searching for it. And some of the balls sink and other ones don't, even though they look exactly the same. And making that an introduction, especially at like the earlier grade levels, so students are considering buoyancy and the fact that there's more to it than just the shape of an object or the size of an object, allows younger kids to really start to grapple with that idea in a way that's much more authentic and feels like something that they're connected to. So this is a great example of a phenomenon that's tied into a storyline that provides context, it provides interest, it gives the kids something to investigate. And I believe in this example, Jeanine was talking about how they go through and they do similar things in their classroom where they're using the lacrosse balls and the tennis balls and seeing how they react when they drop them in water. So it's a really authentic way of using storyline by creating this context that students were experiencing. You take something beyond just that first experience of the ball sinking or floating, but it becomes very real as it's connected to a story, and it just makes it a richer conversation for students to explore. So that was kind of the moral of that story. You can go to the next slide, Jar, and I believe we're going to actually pass it off to Regina and Annette.
Hi, everyone. So I teach chemistry and I direct the research program at Burnt Hills. So I'm coming up the 9-12 segment. And Jeanine is she 3-5?
She's actually K5.
Oh, K5, okay. So having taught for a few decades, working with Jeanine this year has been super invaluable for me. And if I was to offer one bit of advice, would be possibly on a conference day that you propose as a department getting together and examining small bits and pieces of these new standards. Because as we were going through the standards as a group throughout this year, it really struck me I personally believe there are major holes in these guidelines and standards. We were talking about vocabulary where they expect the students to know one thing, but then when they come up to my level, they use a different term. So for me, what was really valuable was hearing, bouncing ideas off of Jeanine for that primary level. And then what I did, my part is I took these standards and I'm like, okay, what can I use? Because there's so much information out there. I was absolutely getting overwhelmed. How can I make this work for me? And so these next few slides are a few of the, I thought for me personally, really valuable sources. And so I linked them. So each of the purple, those are links. So I don't know if we can share the links or how we can do that, maybe put them in the chat or something. But for instance, on this slide, what struck me was if we're just focusing on energy, that even though Jeanine does teach kinetic energy, that term kinetic is not used until middle school. And so when we were talking about the, let's say the movement of the balls or transfer of energy, you know, where do you as a district start to propose that term kinetic? And then I noticed, and then the other thing I noticed was, all right, they bring in that whole kinetic energy 6 to 8, but then 9 to 12, we're talking more about conservation of energy and the entire relationship of the entire system, not just the two balls. Or if you have a hot potato, where does that energy go? So I highlighted obviously where I wanted you to focus. If you look under the physical science in regards to the biology, I think that's the bio. Yeah, you know, finally they bring out that word photosynthesis, but not until the end band. You know, they talk about sunlight makes your face warm. That's it for K2. And I think sometimes, I think teachers sometimes try to take off more than they can chew. And in regards to the children, so what happens is we end up repeating ourselves. So we were talking about how, you know, in I do a demo, but the kids are like, oh, I've seen that before. But I think that's important for us as educators to know, yes, they might have seen it before, but how can we expand it to match our standard, what we're trying to relay to the students. Next slide, please. Next. Thank you. So this is just kind of pointing out the actual statements of the concepts so you can get a better idea of, you know, in regards what the kids actually need to understand within that grade level. So hopefully by the time they're at 6th through 8th grade, they understand that speed is related to energy and that there's conservation of energy. But you don't really, like I said, you don't mention that word kinetic, and you're not even calculating it. Even in 9th through 12th grade, you might talk about bond energies, but you don't calculate them. You talk about nuclear energy. So again, it's just kind of sitting down and slowly, and I don't believe this is absolutely not something you can do within 1 year. And I think that's why we've been given so much time to try and incorporate all this. So when it says not calculate energy, keep that in mind, because I'm going to show you another really valuable resource. Next slide, please. So here are 2 links from the Wonder of Science, and I found that to be a really, really useful, incredibly useful. When I say useful, like it's functioning and it's growing as well. So I think, I don't know if I'm getting this right, but I think Paul started off more in the high school and now he's spreading it out more, or did he start more in the elementary?
I think he started in the high school and he's kind of built it, backfilled it.
Yeah, that's my impression. So on these sites, on this, these are 2 different sites. Well, it's the same site, but 2 different tabs that I pasted next to each other so that you can see it's set up through grade level and through concept that you want to teach. And if you click on those particular blue links within the pieces I pasted in, it brings you to another page. Forward, please. Next slide, please. So this, this is the red section. So I don't know if you can make this bigger. You can zoom on it. I'm not quite sure, but these are clarification statements. So when, and I did not realize these existed. Beautiful. Awesome. Thank you. It tells you, okay, this is the concept that, you know, we're focusing on, but the students do not need to know this. They do not need to calculate this. And that was really interesting when I was working with Jeanine and listening to her perspective, and then, okay, what do my kids need to do? So I thought this was a really valuable site to go to. And obviously the 3 concepts that Rory was speaking about earlier is all on this site as well. And then I think finally, next slide, please.
Yeah, and just as a note, you'll see that they're color coded. The disciplinary core ideas, the practices, and the cross-cutting concepts in those boxes down below. So they're actually broken out for you when you look at these standards documents of the things that you could be focusing on for those grade levels and what you're doing.
And for me, it was completely, I knew this existed. I knew it was there, but I was completely overwhelmed by it. And looking into it now, no, you just have to take your time and piece your way through it. But on the next slide, yeah, this is where when you click those blue links, you come to a page. And this is phenomenal because on this page, it lists the different phenomenon that you can introduce your topic with. It gives you lessons, it shows you connections, it even gives you assessments and video clips. It's just, he just keeps building this up and up and up. And so I personally would encourage you to look at this site. Also the North Country Cafe, even though I'm not really quite sure that's being updated at this point, but for me personally, I thought these were really valuable resources to try and start introducing claim evidence reasoning and phenomenon and modeling. And I think personally, I think that's the angle. I know Stephanie's not here right now, but Stephanie Loomis, she's on the board, and she's pretty sure that's also the direction that we're going to really be asking our students to focus in on. And I think is that my last slide?
It might be. Jerry, just go to the next one. Thank you, Regina.
You're welcome.
I believe the next one might take us to Jeanine again.
Yes, and hopefully, can you hear me now? Hopefully
Yes.
No. Okay. Sorry, I apologize for that. Living in a rural community. So when we were looking at the progression within the next gen standards or the NYS standards, we started having quite in-depth discussions of states of matter, and we were looking at how they scaffold upon each other, starting with kindergarten, where students are looking at what matter exists as a solid or a liquid depending on the temperature. And, you know, as we progress, then we get into second grade where we talk about how different kinds of materials are used for different purposes based on their properties. And what we noticed was that some of the areas they've kind of missed, or where we were kind of wondering how students are going to make the connection. For instance, that in kindergarten, we talk about solids and liquids based on temperature. Second grade, we're also looking at, reversible and non-reversible changes. but nowhere in that progression do we talk about gases. And we don't talk about gases until 5th grade. And but we've noticed that in 3rd grade in weather and climate, students are relating water processes, which is, the water cycle and, evaporation. So students do need some understanding of what a gas is, but it's not really touched on till 5th grade. So again, looking at the progression, some of them and the scaffolding, some of the standards work really well. But then again, we found areas and kind of had really in-depth discussions on how students would connect that content without having been investigated in the phenomenon. Personally, and we got into discussion, I tend to bring it into even the kindergarten classes with discussing what gases are, and then again in 2nd grade, and having students, we model how the molecules are gaining energy and how they change from, a solid to a liquid to a gas. So, in some of the content as we progress forward, some of them scaffold really well. But again, we did have discussions about where some content may be kind of vague, and students are, how we can bring that into the classroom so that students can make those connections, again, to other phenomena. So.
Yeah.
And next.
Yeah.
Slide.
Next slide. So the next slide we're going to Lisa, and actually that conversation Jeanine was mentioning during our meeting was a very interesting one, because we spent probably half that meeting trying to find gases because we thought we had missed them somewhere. We were like, they've got to be here, but they just weren't. So Lisa, we're up to you.
Yeah, and I think that it's good that you're making that connection, because when I was looking at, I teach earth science, and so I was thinking about our conversations that we've had in our group meeting. One of the things that played out for me was that idea of these states of matter, and one of the phenomena that Regina was pointing out was we were looking at this little snowman, and how it melts, and how Paul Anderson in his site uses that same phenomenon at different levels, so the students would see those phenomenon time and time again for their early grades. And so, Jeanine might show those multiple times. And we talked, and we're linking that, as Jeanine just did, to weather. And so I stemmed off of that, and then also went back a little bit into a conversation that we had earlier in our discussions about extreme weather phenomenon, and we were looking at how that progression works. And so these are basically like the idea that students at the K2 level are just making observations, recording stuff with weather instruments. We're using the language of just their observations. So we're not necessarily using what we would typically think of using, like we're taking temperature. Hopefully we're using temperature and thermometers, but it's not a requirement. And that, that to me was sort of interesting. And I would encourage, as Jeanine does, and would encourage other teachers at the elementary level to use those words. We had a great conversation with Jeanine about the fact that we can't underestimate our young people, that they can take these terms and they can really grow with them. And so I thought that was really important. And I think that, we're always asked about like, what's the vocabulary that they need? And we don't necessarily know that vocabulary, but we shouldn't hold back vocabulary just because of the students' age level. And so when I was thinking about this, I was sort of thinking about, here's the basic idea, but of what we're supposed to be doing for the students in terms of their content. But what does that really look like when we start to put the whole science and engineering practices together with the cross-cutting concepts? And really that's what the extensions are doing, is looking at those extreme weather phenomenon and letting them look at, especially since some of these things are starting to hit a lot closer to home for us, no matter where you are in the United States, but especially here in New York State. And NOAA has some great just graphics that show the different trails of hurricanes over the course of the year. And I have a child. Apologize for that. And then when we get up into the 3-5, we again see these weather and climate come into play, but now we're looking at climate regions across the United States. And so I thought it was sort of interesting that a teacher could opt to also align them with the geographical regions. That's sort of been taken out of our content area, and it's not even taught in social studies. So they're not really aware of the geographic pattern. So it might be a good place to kind of insert that for our students to learn a little bit more about the country. But again, NOAA is great for its historical data in terms of climate and patterns throughout the United States. Dude, you got to stop. And then here again, we're trying to use the language that supports understanding information. What really stood out to me was I teach my students right now at the 10th grade level about orographic effect and the way that wind and water move over mountains. And my students at the 10th grade level have a difficulty understanding that, but really that's now at the 3 to 5 level where they should be learning about that, and using those terms might be difficult. We might start off with rain shadow effect versus using the big term like orographic effect, but really those are the terms that we would want to support, but maybe not fully expect that they're memorizing these big terms and being able to use them. And then as an extension is looking at, we did some work with some simulators and some games, and we had a lot of fun kind of looking at how these fun, loosely when we're talking about extreme weather events, but kind of playing with these. And we used some PBS model games, but I recently was doing a lesson plan, and NOAA has these SciJinx simulations, and they can really get at the size. The tornado one is you change the size and the speed of the wind and see how it destroys this house, and things that we can't necessarily see or experience, hopefully, without using like a tornado simulator. I know we have one at our local Sky Zone, but without getting into one of those tornado tubes, it might be difficult. So sometimes these simulators are the way to go. And then it's interesting because it jumps. There's no weather and climate in 6 to 8, which I thought was really interesting, that there's this jump. But then when we get to high school, the idea that we've noticed over a trend is that, especially in earth science, and I think a little bit into bio from what I've looked at, is that it's more the application of all of this information. So we've moved all the content down to the lower levels, if you will. And in high school, it's now looking at addressing climate along with the sun and its output, and accessing these things. And NASA, and if you're not familiar, the SLO satellites have really great information on solar output and solar flares. And then really looking at our human decisions and how we can move forward, and either how we've impacted these changes, and then how we can sustain and survive through these. And it's really an interesting conversation that we've had about how do we scaffold the learning so that students can really start to think about these larger, really engineering and technology pieces that will sustain life here on our planet for us as humans, especially in the earth science trajectory. But I don't even know if I summarized well all the conversation over the years that we've had about this, but I tried.
The next slide too, I think, just has a little bit more about the weather, but it's just kind of an extension. So Jerry,
yeah, these are the actual word for word.
Yeah. But yeah, you summarized all of this even as part of that. So Jerry, you can go right to the next slide. And I pulled a couple of examples from the life sciences. natural selection and adaptation. And this is interesting because I really focused on the vocabulary so you can start to get a sense of what your students would need to know at different levels. So Jerry, you can go right to the next slide. This is the one for NGSS. This is exactly as these standards are written. You'll see that for natural selection, there is no K2 standard. But as we move into the next section, you'll see there things like individuals of the same species kind of being what they're talking about when it comes to natural selection. They talk about characteristics. When you get to the 6 to 8 band, that middle school level, they're talking about natural versus artificial selection, talking about the advantages that individuals have surviving and reproducing and dominance of traits. And then in 9-12, they actually talk about natural selection only occurring if there's a genetic variation that leads to some difference in traits, which is kind of interesting. And we're going to highlight this when we look at the New York State version of it. And for adaptation, you'll see how they really change how they refer to these things. They go from being living things to organisms to species, and then they talk about evolution in the end. So it really does give you a sense of how they're looking at this over time. Jerry, you can go to the next slide. And over the next couple of slides, I actually highlight some of that a little bit more. This is just that band broken down just specifically as it's written in NGSS and NYSLS. This is the NYSLS version. You'll see that there's absolutely no change. And in the 9 to 12 band is when they really start talking about the things that we think of evolutionarily. So survival and competition and all of that stuff and traits over there. You can go to the next slide. This is a list, and this is another thing that comes right from Paul Anderson's Wonder of Science website. At the end of the state standards, he looks at the end of those grade bands and say, okay, what is it that kids need to know? So you see there's left blank through grade 2. By the end of grade 5, talking about differences in characteristics between individuals provide some with an advantage for surviving, finding mates, and reproducing. By the end of grade 8, we start talking about genetic variation, talking about that process of natural selection, and also talk about what humans have done with artificial selection. Now, I know when I was teaching in high school, which didn't seem like that long ago, but I guess it was, and I was teaching living environments, artificial selection, talking about genes and phenology, all of that was stuff that was part of that curriculum, which is now back into the middle school grades. And then you see in the grade 12 band, by the end of school, they're supposed to know a little bit more about natural selection and knowing that genetic information needs to be different between organisms and there needs to be a different expression in order for it to have an impact on selection process. So that's kind of straightforward and interesting for natural selection. Go to the next one, Jared. Adaptation is one that I chose because it's an example where New York State standards add a little bit. I don't know how much you know about New York State standards, but they're notorious for adopting something like Common Core, like Next Generation science standards. And they have this privilege to add a little bit more. And this is one of the areas they did that. So the change in language, first of all, moving from living things to organisms and environments. They don't talk about environments in the K2 band. They talk about places they live. Moving into the middle school bands where they talk about species and then environmental conditions, not just environments, but environmental conditions, and then talking about adaptation by natural selection. And then in 9 to 12, evolution results from genetic variation. And you can see a lot of the things you would equate to evolution there. Competition for resources, being better suited to survive, reproduce, adaptations, talking about specific expansions or extinctions based upon changes in those conditions. And then it's important to think about that 3 to 5 spot that they added. They added this idea that populations of organisms live in a variety of habitats, and changes in those habitats can affect the organisms that live there. That becomes really important because we're going to look at some of their new sample questions in just a moment. You go to the next slide, Jared. This is just another example from Wonder of Science. So at the end of 2nd grade, what everybody's supposed to know, the big switch being by 12th grade, understanding this idea the factors that cause that result from natural selection, and that this leads to adaptation. Basically, in 12th grade, defining it within all the work that's been done for the 12 years, which is kind of cool. Go to the next slide, Jared. We're going to start winding this down now. So one of the things we found most challenging when we were looking at these standards was that a lot of times it was really hard for us to figure out what cross-cutting concept we should focus on. And frankly, some of the practices were also like this. When we went through and we were looking at a particular grade level band, we were like, okay, well, what would we think we should be focusing on there from those two areas? And several times it wound up being everything, because you were making observations, you were comparing and contrasting, you were collecting data. So really honing in on that and really looking at that part of the standards as they're written is something that is going to require a little bit of skill development on teachers' parts. We were also concerned about phenomenon across grade levels being the same. We trying to avoid the why this again, which was alluded to a little bit before about, you're like, I just saw this. Why are you showing me the melting snowman again? It's more difficult to teach ways of thinking along with content knowledge and give these big picture views. So what we're asking students to do as far as once we frame all of this is a little bit more complicated, which we're going to see in a second. And the big question was, even if we're starting late now, can we really change students' concepts and views of what it means to learn something? And when we show you those sample questions, you'll get an idea of that too. And student designing experiments and inquiries, it's a little uncomfortable for some teachers. Next slide, Jared. So the sample questions for grades 5 and 8 test questions, which are rolling out over the next 2 years, were just released. You can go right to the next slide, Jared. And I'm going to share with you in a second the beaver cluster sample. Keep in mind that there are 6 questions there, and they're over 7 pages, but the best way to describe them is by showing them to you. So I'm going to share my screen briefly. And this is the beaver cluster. Notice that it starts with this graphic with some information on it about beavers and different things that they've evolved into having, like the fat, heavy tail for swimming. Talks about the beaver, New York State's official mammal. Goes on to talk about how all of these different parts of the beaver, or many of them, allow them to do things that have helped them survive in the environments that they find themselves in. The first question, talking about identifying one external structure or function that support the beaver in its habitat. So think about those standards. One of the things where organisms survive in a multitude of habitats that can be affected by the environment. So this requires a little bit of an understanding of being able to apply that concept. Nowhere would you have probably talked specifically about the beaver's adaptations to survive in New York State or elsewhere, but it is part of the questioning. So again, the test is sampling what students are able to do. Here, there's a little, some facts that were gathered about the beaver, and then your typical question where which of these facts are, which of these describe how they support the survival of the beaver. Again, needing to understand that survival is directly related to the adaptations that the beaver may have come across. Here's a map that shows the beaver populations from 2 coasts. I know we're down to a very short time, but I'll just show that briefly. One of the things that concerned me was the fact that they have 2 graphs here to use as data. One is the number of beavers, the other one is the family sites of beavers. So we're looking at 2 different things. We're also looking at different timescales on the 2 graphs, which might be confusing for some students in different range of dates. You can just see the dates compared and contrasted there. And here it asks you to use evidence from that. And then it goes on to even give another application question about designing sites for homes that you're being asked to do and recommend one of these 2 designs, and asks you which would be better for the beaver population. Now, none of these in and of themselves are so awfully difficult. I'm just going to stop sharing now so we can wrap up and talk. So any initial impressions of those 7 pages of text to actually use 6 questions, including graphs and pictures and diagrams. Anybody want to guess what test that was from? Anybody surprised that that was the 5th grade test that your students, if you have 2nd and 3rd graders now, are going to be exposed to in just a couple of years?
This is, as Rory indicated, this has been a labor of love. And so very much appreciate the New York State Master Teacher Program and all of the teachers who have been involved with the many series that we have been offering since the pandemic. Thank you all and have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend. As I always say, health and happiness to everyone. And we will be sharing out some wonderful opportunities over the summer, always free of charge, and feel free to take advantage of them as your time permits. So until then, take care.